I'm Sam Roberts of the New York Times, and welcome to the New York Times Close-Up. On this program, we feature leading newsmakers and the New York Times journalists who cover them. This week, you'll meet my colleague, Amisha Padnani, to discuss her groundbreaking New York Times obituary series and now book, Overlooked, paying tribute to remarkable people whose deaths were not originally reported by the New York Times. But first, our city's office space glut, declining demand from businesses for physical space following COVID. It remains one of New York's greatest economic challenges. One neighborhood faced a similar crisis even before the pandemic, and can New York's financial district be a template for the rest of the city? Metro desk reporter Matthew Haag covers the intersection of real estate and politics. So what's the outlook, Matthew, for the rest of the city? The financial district seems to have handled that conversion fairly well so far.
The financial district has, and it really is a roadmap for what could happen to the rest of the city. But by and large, almost 4 years after the pandemic started, office space is still, vacant space is still high as companies adapt to a new hybrid workplace, and people go into the office far fewer, 2 or 3 days a week and not 5. And so what has happened is there's a lot of empty space and not a lot of demand. And so the intuitive answer to that would be make another use out of it, like housing. And that is exactly what the financial district did starting in the 80s and 90s. And surprisingly, over the last couple of years and into the future, there will be new buildings that have gone under construction and opening up, and really has changed the neighborhood in a very dramatic way.
If people have a place to live, which obviously is important, do the jobs still exist for them to work, even if they're working remotely?
Yes, and for the story that I wrote, people were working remotely for companies in New York, but wanted to live in Manhattan and wanted to live in Lower Manhattan in the financial district just because of sort of the charm and uniqueness of the neighborhood. And so there are people who still work here and may not go into the office as much as they used to, but they want to live in the city.
What are the financial incentives for owners of buildings? Do they make more on rent or selling the buildings as co-ops or condos, or do they make more keeping them as offices, assuming they can fill them as offices?
Office buildings demand the highest rent or just value that they bring in over a year. But when there's no demand, you're not bringing in any money. So the next best option would be housing, but converting an office building is very expensive to make it into housing. Wall Street area has its own sort of uniqueness that makes it more doable than other neighborhoods. But besides that, housing's the next best option. Condos bring in a lot, but we also need a lot of rental units. And so there are rental units that are not inexpensive. They're $4,000, $5,000, $6,000 a month in the financial district. And so you see developers saying, I'd rather not sit on empty office space, make another use of it, and bring in some new money.
Physically, how hard is it to convert from office space, either old office space or relatively new, into apartments?
It is quite difficult. What makes it easier in the financial district is a lot of the buildings are decades old when they're not as large as they are perhaps in Midtown. And so you have the smaller footprints and floor plates that allow more light to come in. So that's the big problem. When you convert an office where it might have a conference room with no windows and you need to make a bedroom with windows, that costs a lot of money, and sometimes it's just not feasible. It's just more feasible to tear down the building perhaps to build a residential building. So only certain types of buildings work. The tall, slender ones that happen to be in the financial district are better. But in Midtown, with the deep, dark corridors, it's quite hard, and that's why you haven't seen a lot of action in Midtown.
A tall, narrow building like the Flatiron building.
Exactly, and that's what happened in recent weeks. They bought it and said they're going to make it into condos, 30 to 40 condos, because there's numerous windows. It just makes more sense to make something out of empty space. It's
fascinating because, as you said in that Times story, whole neighborhoods are evolving from this conversion. Financial district downtown, of course, Battery Park City, all the way in the west, are becoming places where instead of seeing people running to work in suits and ties during the day, you see parents with strollers.
That's right. In the 90s, just not that long ago, there were just a few thousand people who lived in the financial district who would be there after, 6 o'clock at night when the bankers and insurance agents went home. And now it's about 65,000 residents. There's still a lot of people who work there, but at night you see strollers, you see restaurants that are open and shops and bakeries and coffee shops. It's totally different. And it's been remarkable how you can build a residential neighborhood out of what was a largely commercial district in just a matter of years.
Are there other districts that are seeing conversions at that kind of pace, that kind of quantity in Manhattan and in the other boroughs as well?
Not really. There really hasn't been a change. I mean, Mayor Adams in Hochul sure would like to see that happen, and they've encouraged developers to think that way. But the financial district had tax incentives starting in the 90s to about 2005, 2006 that really spurred a lot of the change. They've now expired, but there's not those tax incentives that are hanging over these buildings to incentivize developers to do it. And so there really hasn't been the pace of change elsewhere. There's been a lot of proposals, but not a lot of movement.
So do we think that the city will offer some tax incentives for those people in Midtown, other landlords, developers? And also, are they offering some incentives for owners of 1- and 2-family houses to convert basements and other empty space into apartments?
Well, there's been a lot of talk about offering incentives, not a lot of movement on there. Maybe in the coming session in the state, there might be some sort of action to incentivize it. It was a state action that brought the tax incentives to Wall Street. So there could be something. Developers are saying we do need something to get moving, and we would like to change some office building, what they call Class B, the older space, or Class C, stuff built in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, into housing. But really, it's just so costly to essentially gut an office building. There needs to be some sort of tax incentives, they argue, to make it financially viable to do it. And there are some programs that are starting for housing to add additional units. But really, you look at an office building, there's so much potential to add hundreds of units in one building that would be a way to answer both the glut of office space and this housing crisis that we're still in.
Until that conversion takes place, and depending where it takes place, you go through the city, you go through all parts of the city and see so many vacant retail places. Yeah. How bad is that situation in terms of people having stores, other retail opportunities that just aren't paying rent? And why, is something I never understood, why do landlords prefer to keep a place vacant rather than lowering the rent and letting someone stay there?
Well, what I've been told is that with a vacant space, you'd rather hold out for a good tenant, like a Starbucks or a bank or a pharmacy like a CVS, something that will sign a long-term lease, has good credit, and pays every month. They'd rather have that sort of tenant. But there's not that many to go around for every vacant storefront. But
it seems like there are banks and Starbucks everywhere.
Right, I guess they could be everywhere if they wanted to. But with a vacant storefront, that was an issue before the pandemic. It has only gotten worse as companies struggled and shops struggled and then closed, and you just see a lot of for lease signs, and even avenues like Madison Avenue that used to be just dominated by large luxury retailers. There's vacant space there too, and so it's all over the city. And I think that just over the coming years, there's going to be a change when it comes to storefronts. Perhaps they'll have to ask lower rents. Perhaps different types of stores will go in there, and then the same thing with office buildings, new uses for those too. So we're sort of in this pause of what's going to happen with all this space. People want to live here. That is proven to be true during the pandemic. But just what happens with all this space?
Not on the ground floor, though. They're not going to live.
No, not so far.
Thanks to Matthew Haag of the New York Times for joining us. And coming up next, remembering the people the New York Times has overlooked. Since the New York Times began printing newspapers in 1851, reporting on a person's death was reserved for, you guessed it, mostly white men. In 2018, Amisha Padnani, an Obituaries editor, determined to change that. She created a belated series of remembrances dedicated to the noteworthy yet overlooked lives, originally women and people of color. Her award-winning creation is now available in book form called Overlooked, and she's here now to tell us about those who inspired her and the project that has taken on a life of its own. Gay Talese wrote a couple of decades ago that women and blacks hardly ever seem to die in the New York Times. Why was that?
Oh, that was really appreciated. You know, We hear a lot about men, and mostly white men, who die. Every morning, my colleagues and I sit in a room and we look over a list of names of people who have died, and it's true, those are the people we hear about, is mostly men. And so I made it my mission early on when I joined the obituaries team to go out and look for other people, reaching out to our foreign correspondents, for instance, in the far-flung parts of the world to let us know if somebody on their beat dies. I just think that there are other methods of finding people. We're just not hearing about them.
Something like 150,000 people die a day all over the world. We pick 3 or 4 maybe to put on our obituary pages. Were we exercising prejudice, discrimination all those years back? Or, as Bill McDonald, our obituaries editor, said, were we looking at deaths through sort of a rear view mirror, that these were the people who were prominent, noteworthy in their time? And obviously things have changed over time, and minorities, women have obviously gotten more important because they've had more opportunities.
Yeah, that's right. The common saying on our desk is that we are covering people who are of a generation when women and people of color weren't invited to the table to make a difference. And so naturally, in a generation or two, you'll start to see more women and people of color in our coverage. And there is absolutely some truth to that. But I believe, and as this project and this book shows, that people were there all along. They might have been a little bit more in the shadows. Maybe they died in obscurity and we just didn't learn about them. I mean, there are a whole host of reasons why we may not have covered these people, but not having been on the desk for 172 years for the New York Times' history, we can only surmise what editors were thinking. We didn't always even have an obituaries desk, for instance, so other editors of other desks would have to just, pay attention to deaths that were noteworthy.
Yeah, we know they were overlooked. We don't necessarily know why, and we have to assume in some cases it might well have been discrimination against women, against minorities. We know now people call and say, why didn't you have an obituary about such and such? And often it's because we didn't know. And we count on people to tell us when someone dies, and people often do. How did you pick the obituaries for the newspaper, for NY Times Online, in the first place? How did you pick which ones were overlooked that belatedly we should not overlook?
Well, it sort of began when I stumbled on this website talking about the history of tennis, and it mentioned a woman named Mary Outerbridge, who was credited with introducing tennis to America in the late 1800s. And so I looked in our archives to see if she had received an obituary, and lo and behold, she hadn't. And so I started just wondering, who else have we missed? And it just sent me on this journey. Anytime I came across an interesting name in my research, I would search our archives. I started talking with some colleagues who would also recommend people, and we had some real big surprises. Sylvia Plath, the brilliant poet, Ida B. Wells, a pioneering investigative journalist who started a campaign against lynching, even Alan Turing, the computer programmer whose brilliant machine helped end World War II by decoding German messages. And so we knew that these people obviously should get an overlooked obituary. But then we also have all these really quirky, fun stories that just these sort of unsung heroes that we have a whole section in the book, for instance, called Capturing the Imagination. And I just love Annie Edson Taylor. She was the first person to go over Niagara Falls in a barrel and survive. Others had tried before, but did not make it.
Why would somebody do that?
It was her 60th birthday. It was a get-rich-quick scheme. The World's Fair was happening. She thought, maybe I'll get publicity this way. She didn't get rich off of it.
But she lived to be 61.
She did, and for a while after that as well. She would peddle her book, on street corners, didn't have much luck. One time she was held up and she told the robbers, blow away, I'd rather be without my brains than without my money. But they stole her barrel, so unfortunately she didn't have that.
You chose a couple of mine in the book. My favorite, there's one about the original Aunt Jemima and the inventor of the Toll House cookie, but my favorite was Elizabeth Jennings, who tried to get on a bus in downtown Manhattan in the 19th century and was thrown off because she was black, and she sued and won And this was 100 years before Rosa Parks, and for the most part, nobody ever heard of her. So why wouldn't she have gotten an obituary at the time, do we think?
Yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, Rosa Parks really stole the show, huh? 100
I
years
guess
later.
so.
And
No.
here's Elizabeth Jennings doing the same thing so much earlier. My guess is we just hadn't heard of her and perhaps heard of that incident.
I guess so. Now, you say there's some original ones in the book that had not appeared in print. Where did those come from?
So those just also came from research. I get a lot of pitches these days from readers and from writers, and we always welcome pitches for the series. So some of them are really my new favorites. Terry Rogers, for instance, a transgender ventriloquist who was authentically herself, even though she wasn't always accepted for being herself. She was just such a good ventriloquist, so funny, and other ventriloquists are quoted in the story saying there are these 3 things you need to be an expert ventriloquist. Well, she had this 4th thing, and so she had the range of voice and just the timing and everything. So she's a new favorite, and there's also Rattlesnake Kate, Catherine McHale Slaughterback. That was one of the pieces I wrote. She grew up in the rugged plains of Colorado, very tough farmer. And so one day there was a duck hunt, and she and her son went by horseback to see if there were any leftover wounded ducks that they could cook for dinner. On the way back, she got off the horse to open a gate, and a rattlesnake came. And so she pulled her rifle out and shot the snake. Then another snake came, and another, and she kept looking at her son on the horse. How am I going to protect him? So she grabbed the only thing she could find. It was the signpost, and the sign said "No hunting," of all things. And she proceeded to clobber 140 rattlesnakes to death. 2 days later, after some bed rest, she came and collected their skins, made a flapper-style dress out of them, and accessories. She helped scientists by collecting venom of the snakes, and she gained a secret admirer. Well, I guess he wasn't secret, an admirer, a cowboy poet who wrote to her and said, "Oh, wow, you're mighty pretty," and they exchanged letters for 40 years, but they never met.
Amazing what people are known for. You know, you think, what am I going to be remembered for? And you can't make that kind of stuff up. Now, there are 250 or so that we've done in the New York Times, 66 in the book. How do you research one of these? I mean, now when we do an obituary on deadline, you know, you call the family, you talk to people. How do you research one that might be decades or even a century old?
It can be so tricky. Sometimes you're lucky and there is a descendant who's still alive. And sometimes they're not even aware of the achievement of their ancestor, so that's always a little bit fun to learn and to inspire them. Other times you have to get really creative. A lot of Black people may not have been covered in mainstream media, like perhaps Elizabeth Jennings, and so we look for papers like the Afro-American that would have paid attention to their accomplishments. And so you have to dig a little deeper. Sometimes we're fortunate to have biographers who have neatly packaged a person's life in a book or created documentaries. But sometimes you just have to dig really deep and look into census records and death certificates and whatever you can find. So,
when we've run some of these, have you heard from any of the descendants who say, wow, I didn't even know that about the person, or finally you ran that person's obituary?
Oh, all the time. Margalit Fox, who has retired from the obituaries desk, fantastic writer, she wrote about Margaret Abbott, who is considered the first woman to win in the Olympics. It was, I believe, in France. It was golf, and it was technically before this particular tournament was considered part of the Olympics. So it was kind of later in life that she was recognized. And so Margot called the, I think, great-great-nephew who said, oh, wow, Aunt Margaret did that? And so he had no clue. But other times we actually learn about these subjects through descendants. And there's a beautiful story in there about Sinclair Clark, who he was a tanner. It's part of a taxidermy process. He prepared animals that are in museums all over the world, including at the Museum of Natural History. And it was his granddaughter who reached out to me saying that telling me about how she uncovered his legacy. He was about 90 when she realized he was a taxidermist, and she went to his apartment in the Bronx and tried to talk with him, and he was just sort of a quiet guy. And then he passed, and she never learned about his legacy until a few years later, when she ran into another taxidermist who said, "Your grandfather taught me everything I know." And then she started to dig a little deeper and find out just how accomplished he was.
So can readers and viewers submit suggestions for people who were overlooked that they think ought to get their due finally now?
Absolutely, yeah. On our website, we have a call-out form, as we call it, where people can submit suggestions for an overlooked.
So you're not worried about running out of people?
Oh no, the sky's the limit. I have a very messy spreadsheet of, I don't know, maybe 3,000 names
3,000?
of people who we could potentially write about. And so, lucky for me, this series is ongoing. I publish about 2 a month in the newspaper, and of course the book has 66 pieces in it.
And this is only the first book.
There will be a children's book and a young adult book out in 2025. I don't know about another volume 2 for an adult compilation, but we are covering those age groups.
Amy, you say this has changed the way we look at the obituaries we do on a daily basis. Very hard to explain to someone why their relative, their friend, did not get an obituary online or in the Times when someone else did. Why did this crook or mobster or some no-goodnik get one, but my father or my brother or my friend did not? How has it changed the way we look at people we choose who are worthy in our definition of worthiness to get an obituary?
Yeah, so this process, we call it a vetting process. It's complicated. I mean, who are we to make these judgment calls about who is worthy?
It's such a subjective decision.
It can be, yeah. And ultimately, we rely on what we refer to as news judgment because we need to write about people who readers will care about. How did this person make their mark on the world? What did they leave behind? How did they change the way of life for society or the world at large? And so we really are thinking about what readers will want to know about. And so that's part of the reason, but I do feel like Overlooked has changed our criteria just a little bit. Whenever we hear about women and people of color who die, we really take the time to dig a little deeper into their lives and sort of acknowledging the fact that these people may not have gotten the attention they deserved in their lifetime, and sort of taking the extra initiative to find out, well, what did they do? Were they worthy? Were they the first? Were they the best, or whatnot?
If we had run them originally, do you think it would have made a difference in people's attitudes?
Perhaps. I mean, we can't cover everybody, so we might still have had the same kind of criticism. And of course, what got me initially thinking about diversity and our balance in the newspaper was emails from readers who said, why aren't there more women and people of color in your pages? One reader went so far as to tally, I've counted, and over the last month, 1 out of every 5 obituaries was about a woman. And so, I think it is tough for us to cover everybody, but perhaps if we had initially had that balance and written about these people, we would have no need for a section called Overlooked.
Of course, the more of those we put in and look for, we leave others out. Have we gotten any blowback about that?
No, I don't think so. I don't often hear that. I mean, you're right that occasionally people will say, why didn't you write about my brother, my father, whomever? But I have never heard anybody say, why did you write about that important Black woman instead of this man? Mm-hmm. I don't think people argue a lot with our decisions and what we decide to publish. It's more about, whom we left out.
Very good. Thank you so much for joining us. The book is Overlooked. It's just out. It's a collection of obituaries from the New York Times that we finally caught up on. And up next, I'll share some personal thoughts on the sidewalks of New York. It's no coincidence that for a century, the city's unofficial anthem was "The Sidewalks of New York." New Yorkers walk more than people in any other big city. A new survey by Streetlight finds big post-pandemic declines in walking in most metropolitan areas. the smallest decreases in warmer climates. Remote working has kept more people off their feet, too. Last year, though, New York ranked first for walking activity and number one in walking trips per capita. The average New Yorker walks between 6,000 and 10,000 steps daily, well above the nationwide average of 5,000. As a result, according to some studies, we live longer. 2/3 of New York commuters walk to work or take mass transit, the highest percentage of any big city in the country. Only 1 in 50 live in neighborhoods where they're dependent on a car. Google walking and New York, and you get 1.1 billion results. That's 5 times as many as when you Google walking and Houston. And there are walking guides for every sort of sightseer: architecture, culture, kids, radical history, theater, archaeology, crime scenes, literary New York, film locales, celebrity homes, and more. The Intimate City Walking New York by Michael Kimmelman of the Times is another great source. Sure, it's easy to get frustrated by pedestrians pausing to converse on cell phones or weaving through crowds with their wheelie suitcases trailing behind them. Still, New Yorkers walk faster than pedestrians anywhere else. Hey, we even had a mayor named Walker. For the New York Times and CUNY TV, I'm Sam Roberts.